Wonderful to see we have so many folks on the line today. And Kelly, maybe you can wave hello since you'll be moderating today. Co-chair Kelly Richardson. Hi.
Hey, okay, thanks so much. It's actually been really interesting just looking at how we're pushing the limits of what our homes do for us now. So let's see. What an interesting week. It feels it feels very interesting to be giving a presentation to this group during this week. I know a lot of people are dealing with this in really different ways, dealing with the structural racism that has been so part of our world for such a long time in different ways. I've been thinking a lot about, how structural racism and inequality have been impacting not just our cities, but what duty we have in the planning, design, and architecture and urbanist communities to make sure that we have a diverse field, and also that we are creating the type of future in cities that we want to see that allows for an equitable future. So I firstly just kind of wanted to check in and see how people are feeling and processing whatever's going on in this moment. So in an effort to kind of share with one another in the chat, if you're comfortable, I was going to ask if everyone could just post one word in the chat of what they're feeling like today, where their head's at. That word could be as ludicrous as banana, or could just be a mood. Just kind of need to feel a little bit of, without being there in person, it's always hard to read how people are feeling. So saying frustrated, contemplating, exhausted, lost, frustrated, heavy. Yeah, I think a lot of these feelings I know are I'm also feeling. I know other people are dealing with. This is such a big thing to be dealing with, but I think it's just good to know that that this is happening, that we're all, that we see each other feeling this, and to do what we can to change to change the course of history, hopefully. And so then secondly, I wanted to open up the chat to ask, what is one thing you will do this week to fight racism? So I guess I should also say what I'm going to do this week. I think we've been thinking about this a lot, but then there's so many things we can do, just starting with the one small thing we can do. So I guess actually I'll say mine out loud. One thing I was thinking is really important. I had my money in, I order quite a bit from Amazon. I still bank with Wells Fargo. I feel like now is the time for me to actually take the action of looking at where I'm spending my money and reallocating it to more diversely owned businesses and make sure that I'm doing my part. Oh, okay, that's heavy. Well, I hope this doesn't feel like too strong of a pivot. I'm going to present. And I think one thing that's been really prevalent in the work I am interested in has been really looking at how the physical and virtual worlds are colliding and how much the way we design something impacts human behavior. So as designers and urbanists, recognize that the virtual and physical are both part of spatial design. It's not just the physical aspects, whether that's investigating how user interface impacts where people decide to go in a city, or who has access to what, or seeing how smart home products are changing behavior in our homes, and thus seeing that as part of the design of physical spaces. That has been a kind of obsession. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And feel free to post comments, even if I don't see them as I'm presenting. Hopefully I'll get a chance to follow up on them in the end of this presentation. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Okay, I think it says host disabled attendee screen sharing. So I might have accidentally clicked the attendee link. Oh, you're muted.
That might be a new Zoom feature, because that's never happened before, and they do constantly update. Let's see. Okay. Well, bear with us as we figure out how to do that. I need to change you to a host, a co-host. Make co-host. Yes. All right. So maybe if you try now.
Okay. Yep, that works. Great.
Fantastic.
All right. Can you all see my screen? Should say physical digital design.
Yes.
Got it. Okay. I'm gonna do a full screen. And okay. Thanks so much. So the form and space that we occupy every day can impact our human behavior, but also the ephemeral aspects like time and schedules and policy also define things like who feels welcome, who goes behind a counter, where people walk versus where they drive. So a big thesis is those invisible things like policy and whatnot shape how we behave, but so do the forms and behaviors and affordances of things like a escalator or a counter. But today, a lot of our behavior is sculpted by the computerization of every aspect of life. Most of our social and economic relations take place through platforms like Facebook and Venmo. Tinder's matching algorithm leads to an increasing number of matches and marriages each year. Ultimately, its algorithm will shape the genetic makeup of the human race. As swipes are made, humans are matched, and babies are born. The filters of StreetEasy dictate what someone sees. They literally filter the makeup of who lives in what neighborhoods, reprogramming entire city zones. Yelp reviews choreograph people through siloed canals across the city. When recommendation engines reinforce the user's preferences, they generate spatialized filter bubbles. So the invisible code that powers a city's use may have more drastic influence than any physical invention in the last century. As urbanists and designers, we have to think and design for those invisible systems. When UX designers think about design, they can't just think about the user interface. They have to think about where people might be when they see that interface. They have to think about the spatial interface. But it's not just the scale of the user we have to think about or where something happens. The scale and ubiquity of digital apps doesn't just impact one, it has emergent properties, cascading impacts that generate traffic jams. A tweet can incite major revolutions. A change in the Facebook news feed can change the outcome of elections. So where the distribution of information and news was once constrained by physical location, now information can be spread instantaneously across the globe. And when many people at large scales act in unison, we see new phenomena. So everyone might get information all at once via social media or something, and everyone acts all at once, channeling people to the same locations, signaling changes in behavior on a massive scale. So we can't just design for the user, for the one person. We have to design for the societal experience, how it will impact many people. This is especially important for the fields of UX design and human-computer interaction. But how can urbanists design for these emergent behaviors that are changing and shaping our cities? Behavior in space has been studied in the past. This isn't a totally new phenomena. From Lillian and Frank Gilbreth, who studied how time and motion could optimize space for factories and homes. What actually led to what you're seeing on the right is the workers triangle. If you notice where your kitchen sink is versus your oven and your fridge, these are often arranged to be optimal for your physical movements so that they're within arm's reach of one another. And a lot of that design came from that work, where they would tie lights to a person's hand and have them do cooking tasks over and over and try and optimize to minimize the amount of spatial movement that had to take place. Also, Louis Kahn studies of motion based on the form in roads. Also, space planning understands how the network of which types of activities are adjacent in the home actually fundamentally change what types of experiences someone can have. So whether you interact with people on a day-to-day might depend on, do you need to cross your roommates when you go to a particular location? But today we need ways of modeling and testing the large-scale behavioral changes, a design before they occur to understand those emergent properties I was talking about. So in my class, Data Mining the City, graduate architecture and urban design students don't just think about the physical aspects, the walls, streets, and infrastructure, but we try to think about time, behavior, policy, and think about this at scale, since they have spatial implications. This allows us to look at things like how the internet may allow for the sharing of resources between existing neighborhoods, or how autonomous vehicles fleet size impacts congestion, or estimate pickup times based on the UI changes you make in a website in a ride-sharing app. Or look at the spread rate of a virus based on policy, or explore how Google Maps routing could optimize for users' preferences to walk past nature, quieter streets, or places with more activity. And I think it would be interesting to think about how this changes large-scale and emergent flows of many people when you change something like Google's routing algorithm. But what about digital designers, user experience, and industrial designers? We know that digital technology has often had that same societal and spatial blind spot. This is my Amazon Echo. I put an eye on it because I thought it was funny. And I'm going to read this Amazon Echo patent for you because I think it's also funny. Alexa, I'm hungry, sniffle. Would you like a recipe for chicken soup?
Yes, recipes.
Oh, she always goes off when I say this too.
I'm having trouble accessing the recipes.
No thanks. okay, I can find you something else, by the way. Would you like to order cough drops with 1 hour delivery? That would be awesome. Thanks for asking. No problem. I'll email you an order confirmation. Feel better. I think it's funny how we try and emulate this kind of social interaction that feels absurdly awkward. It doesn't feel like it's been designed for human behavior. So it's important to understand behavior through like those real life interactions, not just simulations that impact that city scale. But because buildings could take decades to build, architects have to create models that simulate what will happen. What's interesting about Internet of Things and smart home products to me is that the design changes that can be quickly deployed so that we can quickly understand the changes that influence human behavior.
Surface won't let me zoom. Pick me off. So I have to do my phone. Both surfaces?
Uh-oh, I think someone's not muted. Sorry about that. So what's interesting about these smart home products is that those design changes happen so quickly so that you can get feedback on when a design change happens. How does that influence behavior? Whereas an architect, you usually don't really understand how is someone going to use the home until decades or years later. But not anyone can design a smart home product. The zeros and ones is more illustrative than anything, but I can't design a smart home product without an extensive engineering degree. So it's not very accessible. Arduinos are a bit more user-friendly, but still require a little bit more knowledge of programming. And then there's microservices, things like if this and that, if you're familiar, use these simple statements that are almost conversational that allow you as a non-expert or a non-programmer to design functionality of your smart home products. So you have something like, oh, if the temperature raises some amount of degrees, then turn a fan on in the room. So microservices are written in a way that's different from monolith applications, what you see on the left, where one small snippet of code talks to much more complex code behind the scenes. You write that tiny statement, if the fan turns on, do this, and then that will talk to complexity that executes that between different IoT services. What's exciting about this to me is that there's an opportunity for not just designers, but occupants of buildings, people that don't have a programming background, the people who actually live in spaces to design and prototype their physical environments by writing really simple instructions. So I've been co-teaching this class, Measuring the Great Indoors, with a woman named Gabby Brainerd, and where we look at the design of dynamic environments through smart home products and projectors to test how to create spatial user experiences. It's been really interesting because we're trying to merge a lot of fields from building science, user experience, physical computing, environmental design. Think about what does it mean to bring these two worlds together. Borrowing from a lot of cybernetic concepts, students design cybernetic systems. So they will create sensors that, they will use sensors that measure something and have actuators that create a change to the physical environment. So by sensor, I mean like a temperature sensor or a light sensor or a motion sensor or something that detects the number of people in a room to trigger a specific behavior around a particular goal. So let's see if I can show some examples of that. Ah, yes, and these are some of like the human, akin to a human sensor, you know, your hand, touch, hearing, sight, and things that drive that change could be things like a speaker or motion. So using if this then that, we did a lot of prototyping on what these interactions could be. These are like some very silly things we did just with index cards, imagining, mixing and matching what types of interactions could happen. And then we made up names about what these new dynamic environments or services could be called. And then going from there, students design things like lights that changed in a room depending on where you're at in the room. And prototyping with these was really interesting because, you know, designers in the class range from people that were really familiar with programming to ones that were just learning for the very first time. And prototyping these systems was not robust. Like you see here, the light changes when this fiducial marker is blocked, but it takes a really long time. So that they're very glitchy and not necessarily, definitely not ready for the market, but really interesting nonetheless to try and understand how we might imagine our environments as being dynamic or controlled by our actions. The student, she was interested in physical environments having personalities. So how can we think about our IoT systems as having more structured personalities like humans? This was a window that tries to get you to open it during nice weather and reward you when you do. When you looked at how lighting could adapt to people's emotion in a room, and played with the idea of voting systems and consensus based on facial expressions. So I thought that she talked a lot about, you know, what happens during a party when one person is not happy. Does it change the mood or setting of the room? Like, how do you have consensus over these environmental things that impact many people in a room, like sound levels, lighting levels, how rooms are partitioned or not partitioned. These are environmental factors impact everyone, but we don't usually think about consensus or voting in those environments. Serena used fiducial markers on hats to experiment with how you could initiate icebreaker conversations by triggering strange sounds and projections when people were close to one another. So this setup was intended to mimic a larger scale. So imagine that this light is a table and those fiducial markers are hats of people just meeting one another. And I'm not sure, can you all hear the sound?
No sound.
Okay, well I just, it's okay, I don't need to share the sound. Just know that there's like some awkward piano music happening every time those emerge, which I think was really kind of a funny and smart idea. You know, forces people to engage with each other. So what's important about this class to me is that architects, urbanists, we should think about what happens after people move in and about how our spaces will work. And we should think about those both digital and physical things and how those are impacting the way we're using spaces. And I think now more than ever, we have to think about design for the indoor environments and consider the interactions we have via computer are as much part of our home as the kitchen sink is now. So I'm wondering a lot about why can't our virtual interactions with one another be more spatial and not constrained to the screen? Why do I have to call my mom to bump into her? Why do we have to schedule things to have interactions? What would it mean to have a virtual roommate where I just walked into my kitchen and if it was during certain hours, I could bump into my mom or see her on the other side of a counter when we're both in the kitchen at the same time. So I think there's a lot of opportunities to think about telepresence and the home differently and think about these as part of spatial design. It's time to think about design of the virtual and physical as part of spatial design, whether that's investigating how a user interface impacts where people decide to go in a city, seeing smart home products as design challenges for spatial thinkers, or whether that means redesigning the home for new rituals for virtual interacting with distant family and friends. So thanks very much. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts and ideas and changes, disagreements. Here are some links if you're interested in looking at some of the work from those classes. And I'm also sharing this link to a group called Architechies that is a lot of people coming from different fields interested in spatial technologies. And that's it. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Violet. That was really great. Anybody else, but my brain has not quite been in this space lately, so it was nice to start thinking about these things again. So I thought maybe I would ask a few questions and then open it up to everyone else. And just a reminder that if you guys do have questions that you would like to ask, you can either type them into the chat or feel free to unmute yourself. I think maybe my first question, it's not fully formed yet, but could you maybe talk a little bit about how the interaction of digital space and physical space can or potentially is impacting protests that we've seen recently? A lot of them are organized online, and then we're seeing them come together sometimes spontaneously. Yeah, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how it may, in some ways, might be easier to find alliances or just let people know that you're on the same page or supporting one another, which has a big impact in protests. You know, I think just being able to see that protests are happening in another city or across the country might make someone more likely to decide to do the same in their own community, or recognizing that someone else who, you know, lives across the street from you is thinking about going out to do something might make you feel more compelled to engage because you know that someone stands with you, or less afraid to go out. So I think that it definitely is changing aspects. I think the other thing that's really hard, and I haven't figured out, you know, what are the right protocols for dealing with this, but I think with all these, with this ability to measure and know what other people are doing, there's the positive side of that. It's just like, I can find camaraderie, I know other people feel the same way, but there's also changes in privacy and the ability to track and surveil what people are doing. which is a tricky territory that I don't know all the right protocols for, and actually something that was really interesting in this class that I think I should also have another presentation on. Gabby, who co-teaches the class with me, we were talking about doing a presentation just on the difficulties of teaching this class. Problems like if I want to set up an experiment and I want to put a camera somewhere, I obviously can't set up a camera in the school without consent of all those people. Can I do it in my home while my roommate's there? Like, what do they think? What's the difference if I'm recording versus not recording? And what does it mean to change someone's environment based on some triggered set of actions? So I think there's a lot of things that we still need to figure out and sort out that have to do with privacy and measuring behavior.
I had an interesting observation about how the current movement is leveraging Instagram to organize, and it reminded me of the visual example of Yelp in terms of how the interface has an impact on how people move around the city. It kind of reminded me of Blackout Tuesday. I saw like a bunch of people who support the cause but may not really have ever, I mean, to be honest, it seems like they may not have had direct experience with using Instagram or communicating with community organizers. So they would post the black square and then use the hashtag Black Lives Matter. And then I saw a response from digital organizers going and commenting on everyone's post to say, don't use that hashtag because you're flooding the hashtag with just empty black squares that has no information. And there are a lot of people who are very active in this movement and have been using that hashtag for years to actually communicate and find information, because they're not going to a website or a magazine or like a centralized newspaper to find that information. They're using this hashtag to have this live conversation. So I thought that was a very interesting example of how digital organizers were providing instructions to distinguish between sharing information that could lead to action versus just sort of a more visual or aesthetic support, which also has an impact, because maybe the sheer number of people putting up that black square has another kind of outcome in terms of getting media attention, but that may not be related to actually physically organizing.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I think what you're pointing out is that there's what's interesting about all of this is that how information is disseminated is changing so much that we also need to figure out how to structure information that needs to be centralized and disseminated versus like there are intentional structure or power that needs to happen. You don't want anyone can override the message of a large group to get a message out. Yeah, so like there's a lot of questions that we need to figure out about how do you build consensus? How do you distribute information between one to many or a group to many versus like an individual to small groups and to one another? Like those are all different things. I also saw some
we've got a
questions in the thread.
From Tara at Numina. She asked, can you provide some tactical comments on how your work and planners specifically can support Black Lives Matter?
I think whether that's like showing up for protests, donating to bails, making sure police reform is happening in your community. And like one thing I've been thinking about for me is like what conversations haven't been like in my own communities, what conversations have we not had yet? So specifically, like thinking about the design of cities, as a planner, I think, or as a designer, urbanist, any of those groups, I think the first thing that always is glaring to me is being in a room where it's not diverse. Like that has felt unfortunately normal for such a long time for me. And at the point that you start to recognize how non-diverse some of those rooms are, where important decisions are being made about what the shape and makeup of a city is going to look like, you just realize how problematic it is that those aren't balanced. So I think the first thing is to speak up about those things in those rooms. Say, like, we need to hire more diverse groups. We need to make sure that more diverse groups are getting into colleges that are focused on planning or urban design. And I think we also need to bring up some of those tough conversations and ask ourselves, well, you know, I think one thing I struggled with a lot in before I got into tech, I was in the architecture community, and I felt so much like the only thing I could do was design high-end luxury housing in most places. Like, that's kind of what most of architecture is based on. It's like designing high-end architecture. I didn't even know about that I could go work in government and, you know, maybe work for the Center for Urban Pedagogy or something. So I think it's up to us to also change the field on what the norm is of, like, what types of jobs do we want to invest in? Do we have enough power as a group of employees in a firm to say, hey, I don't think that we should spend 80 or 90% of our effort designing these types of projects or investing in these particular spaces, because we're actively investing in only this area or only these types of projects, we're actively not investing in other communities that need it. So I think I think it's really hard as an employee to feel like you have the power to speak up on those things. But I think the more you talk to your peers and employees and have the courage to speak up about it, I think people will want to make changes.
Yeah. We've got another question in the chat here from Shruti. And she asked, with the change in the use of our spaces, even within our buildings, we're using our homes as commercial spaces. Can you explain with an example where this technology or apps can help us plan better land use, better building use, etc.? Sorry if you can hear my cat, she's meowing.
I love it. See, this is what's so great about all these changes. I've seen so many cats like strolling by and just a tail going back and forth in the middle of a very serious presentation. I kind of love it. I think it humanizes all of us. This is a tricky one. It's weird because before we had this strict boundary between work and home, and so like the work pays for the Wi-Fi, they pay for everything associated with work, and then you come home and it's like gone. And then that was already starting to disintegrate because we had our cell phones or like answering emails at all hours on a cell phone. And now even more, it's like, well, does my work pay for my Wi-Fi? Like, do I lease my space on Airbnb and kind of turn it into its own enterprise? So things are definitely becoming more blurred there. I'm not sure about like what the better land use or building use should be, but I think one thing that we need to think about is being more explicit and direct as these boundaries get blurred. I think it's more important to call out what is work and what is not work. I think one thing that has been, I did Airbnb a number of years back, and I remember the kind of how it reshaped even my behavior. Like, it's hard to explain. Like, I felt like I was more, when people would come to my house and rent it, I was nice to them in a way that was like additionally friendly. I hate to say that, but like additionally friendly in the way that I was like operating a business. Like, I recognized the amount of power they had if they gave me a bad review, or like, so it changes your relationships.
So I think what you're talking about is we have more eyes, like virtual eyes on ourselves now. And I guess how can we leverage those eyes, so to speak, to like plan better in the sense like, and to understand, I mean, the changes and like, I'm not asking you to give a solution. I was like, how we can think about it, you know, and with these changes, how we can leverage what we understand by, say, the sunshade thing, that it is telling you to open the sunshade in a certain scenario. So like just leveraging those small things to make our spaces better, and design better buildings, or you know, even or whatever.
How can these like how can the dynamic environments or the ability to change
Absolutely,
and design your own environment make spaces better? Yeah. I think the first is that it allows you to, there's a potential for more flexibility within our homes. So if spaces can be more digitally dynamic, or even physically dynamic, if you have things like shades and walls opening or closing or something, I think there are opportunities for space saving mechanisms, and also mechanisms to change the program of those physical spaces by having them change by time of day, or like what activity you're doing in that moment. I also think they offer another opportunity to have a lot of design that comes from the people that actually occupy the space. The ability for, in the same way that like many apps were shared on the App Store, occupants of buildings might be able to curate widgets for the way their indoor environments interact, or like design things, almost like IKEA hacks, but for like digital IoT type of things. So we can do things that are more comprehensive than, you know, I think there's a lot of kind of gimmicky IoT things that have happened. I think there's a big opportunity for.
Yeah, that sounds absolutely interesting, like how we can inform our spaces ourselves and then try to redesign in this space. So yeah, I was just interested in that. Cool.
Yeah.
It looks like we have group posed a thought/question of, I wonder how we can bring design practice into helping people organize safe social activities in public spaces, self-organizing, figuring things out, like where and how many people, how to use objects to help enforce social distance and creatively enhance communication and connection.
And I would like to add a follow-up to that, specifically for this group of urban planners and urbanists who are sort of, I would say, a couple steps removed from the digital realm and organizing in digital spaces. How are ways maybe that this audience could sort of latch on to one of those safe social distancing or public organizing principles and then support work that's already being done in the space? Or who could we partner with, or what are some first or next steps for sort of digging into this and thinking about it further? Because I feel like all of the questions are can kind of sort of been summarized by this statement, which is thinking about public space and also at-home space and that intersection between the digital and the physical, specifically in this case in terms of organizing.
Yeah, like how do you start to actually actively think about those things and practice them? I think trying to become more interdisciplinary is helpful. So like I found the Architechies community. I can share that link again in an email if that's useful. Just getting to know other people that are practicing in different fields. So like it's been interesting for me to learn a lot more about human-computer interaction and have conversations with people that have been thinking about like user journeys. And likewise has been useful for them to learn about like spatial simulation at the urban scale and how those two fields can start to learn from one another. So I think just finding connections between people that are thinking in a like physical way, industrial design and architecture, and talking to people that are thinking about simulation and technology and analytics, that kind of thing, is one good first step. And then as a total shameless plug, I'll send my link for my classes if you're interested in specific tutorials and stuff. But I think there's a lot of other really great resources out there for people that are doing this type of work.
We have about 6 minutes left. So, and it looks like Mike has posted a question here. What new design feature has this tech shaped in Sidewalk Lab's Toronto project? Is there real on-the-ground implementation of this technology yet?
Which part of the tech? Because I think I spoke about a few different types of technology. I guess one technology that maybe was less applicable in the Toronto project, something that has been some of the Sidewalk Labs work, the generative design product that I started at Sidewalk, is really tied to a lot of this urban simulation work. And so a lot of the ideas behind that is how do we simulate and measure the behavior of master plans well before they are designed or constructed. So this is something that urban design has done for a really long time. We've done daylighting simulations, we've done cost models, we've done aspects that try and measure things like vibrancy or quality of life, access to parks, difference in transit distance between where you live, so I think we've done, like historically, a lot of those simulations have happened, but they've happened in very siloed environments. Someone's working in Excel, someone's working in a 3D modeling program. So a lot of what we've been focused on is how do we automatically run many of those simulations so that we can see, create a much more outcome-oriented approach to planning, that you don't hope something will work out, or like create a design and then wait months before you understand whether it's going to have financial, things won't work out financially in a way that it's like can't support the amount of affordable housing that needs to be there. So I think, yeah, one specific way is definitely in this generative design product. I can also share a link on that, which has been really focused on trying to create a more outcome-oriented method of planning.
Does anyone else have any questions that they are burning to get answered?
Oh, I just wanted to say like a quick thing. That's all right. Can I just say one quick thing if that's all right? Okay, good. Sorry, I was like looking at you, and then I wasn't looking at everyone else on top. No, great presentation. We were talking about Airbnb. It made me think of how we're using technology, and like the gig economy makes this, you know, commodifies everyone, and we kind of we don't really look at our car as like a car to get from point A to point B. Now you have people, largely people of color, who are looking at these opportunities as side hustles because like their main jobs can't help them. So it's just interesting to see how technology, particularly when we're so connected, it reinforces so many of the same inequalities and inequities that we all deal with day in and day out.
Yeah, like changes the expectation of if you can't make ends meet with minimum wage, like almost this weird expectation that, well, you should be leasing out that extra space in your living room, and between non-working hours, why aren't you like driving people around to make ends meet? It's like, it's not always like a great economic opportunity to be commodifying all the aspects of your life. It's like a necessity out of a need to make financials work.
Yeah. Especially when you can like commodify your own body, looking at your body and thinking, oh, like, can I sell some of my hair, some of my plasma, some of these things? Like if you're kind of it forces you to be incredibly, I don't want to say creative because it makes it seem as though you're lacking in imagination, you're using your imagination, but it's actually desperation because you're looking at all these parts and thinking, oh, I can just, I could take off this and I know it'll come back in like a couple months. And it's just, is that like the best way for people to get from day to day?
Yeah. Oh, it's sad. I feel like I've like to feel the effects of what that does to your relationships as well. Like just that experience of having someone come in from Airbnb and me like feeling quasi fake. I like knowing this is a financial transaction, not someone like, hey, come stay at my home, So it like changes every aspect of day-to-day life.
Well, we are just about out of time here. And Savannah posted in there, I don't know if maybe we can send this around in an email afterwards if you have a lot of thoughts on this, but are there any human-computer interaction online courses or tools that you would suggest for people who are interested? I'm definitely have some interest in this, so if you have suggestions, that would be great. We can share it with everyone.
Yeah, I can share some links to like people I've looked at. There aren't any specific classes that come out in my mind, but I bet some people on the call and Rue also might know have some good links who could also share with this group.
And Violet, I just wanted to thank you for starting the conversation today by acknowledging the times and this movement and creating a space where we can talk about that. And I wanted to just thank you for this conversation and the talk and the material. And I definitely think we should work to compile some resources and perhaps, you know, touch base with your Architechies work and see where we can, you know, really do some resource share so we can continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. And great questions, everyone.
Great. Okay, so I think we're going to wrap up. If anyone has any final things to say, I think the call is officially over, so we will let people get back to their lives. But thank you, and yeah, thank you, Kelly, for moderating, and thank you everyone for joining.
Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you, Violet.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.